Hello everyone, and welcome to the Q-Man channel. Be sure to subscribe and hit that like button if you enjoy the content. Today we are going to be discussing the 1991 film, New Jack City. The city is a jungle, and Nino Brown, fresh from the crucible of the crack epidemic's rise, is the apex predator. He doesn't just sell drugs. He builds an empire, child of the 60s, a man who saw the chaos of the 70s and decided to weaponize it for profit, transforming a corner hustle into the monolithic cash money millionaires. His ambition is a force of nature, fueled by a street-smart charisma that makes him both magnetic and utterly terrifying. He runs his operation with the cold precision of a corporate CEO, but the ruthlessness of a medieval warlord, demanding absolute loyalty and delivering brutal consequences for betrayal. Enter the cavalry, or perhaps the cavalry's scrappy, overeager vanguard, Detectives Nick Stone and Scotty Appleton. Stone, a veteran whose soul has been weathered by years of walking the mean streets, views the world with weary cynicism, knowing every bust is just a temporary rearranging of the furniture. Appleton, however, is the new blood, idealistic, driven by a personal vendetta rooted in past losses to the very kind of violence Nino embodies. He approaches the investigation with a focused intensity, believing in the system even when the system seems rigged against them. The dynamic between Stone and Appleton is instantly strained. Stone operates in shades of gray, recognizing that taking down someone like Nino requires more than just handcuffs. It demands understanding the ecosystem that birthed him. Appleton is black and white, determined to use every legal and occasionally extra-legal tactic to put Nino away for good. They are two different kinds of soldiers fighting the same war, often tripping over each other's methods. Nino's rise is meteoric. He recruits Pookie, his childhood friend, who quickly becomes his lieutenant, his right hand in the escalating violence and the nuts and bolts of distribution. Their friendship, initially tight-knit, begins to fray under the weight of paranoia and extreme wealth. Nino's lifestyle screams excess: flash cars, tailored suits, and a fortress-like apartment that serves as both headquarters and gilded cage. He embodies the American dream twisted through a lens of narcotics, a cautionary tale wrapped in Versace. The pressure mounts. Nino's disregard for collateral damage, the lives of innocent bystanders, the devastation of the neighborhoods he claims to rule, becomes increasingly reckless. He's not just moving product, he's corrupting the very fabric of the city. The police, frustrated by the slow grind of evidence collection, are constantly chasing shadows and dodging ambushes, orchestrated by Nino's increasingly professional security force. Stone and Appleton dig deeper, utilizing informants, enduring betrayals, and making necessary compromises just to stay alive long enough to gather the evidence that might stick. Appleton, particularly, finds himself pulled into the street narrative, understanding Nino's motivations not to excuse them, but to predict his next move. He starts to see that dismantling the empire means not just capturing the king, but severing the supply lines and turning the soldiers against one another. The inevitable confrontation builds like a tropical storm. Nino, feeling the walls close in, resorts to ever more extreme measures, seeing betrayal everywhere. Pookie, worn down by the constant fear and the moral compromises, starts to crack, representing the human cost of Nino's ambition. The partnership between the detectives finally clicks into a dangerous synergy. Stone provides the street knowledge, Appleton the unyielding drive. In the final violent calculus, the empire collapses, not just from police pressure, but from internal rot. Nino, despite his overwhelming power and paranoia, is ultimately undone by the very ruthlessness he cultivated. He ends up cornered, a king without a kingdom, the brief, blinding flame of his reign extinguished by the very law he thought he had successfully bought off or beaten into submission. The city breathes a shallow sigh of relief, but both Stone and Appleton know the silence is temporary. The vacuum left by one king is always waiting for the next ambitious newcomer to step in. The narrative unfolds with the intoxicating scent of possibility and impending doom, a classic American story transplanted onto the crumbling concrete of inner-city decay. Nino Brown's ascent wasn't merely about moving kilograms. It was an act of performance art. He modeled himself after the powerful figures he saw on television, melding the swagger of a hustler with the meticulous planning of a young executive desperate to conquer the boardrooms, his boardroom being the city block. His charisma, honed in the unforgiving classroom of the streets, was his sharpest weapon, allowing him to command loyalty that bordered on religious fervor among his crew, the cash-money millionaires. These young men, drawn by the promise of escaping generational poverty through any means necessary, saw Nino not as a dealer, but as a self-made millionaire, a dark mirror of capitalism's dream. Stone, the older detective, carried the weight of 1,000 lost battles in the slump of his shoulders. He'd seen men like Nino before, maybe not with such polished branding, but the hunger was the same. His inspiration felt less like a burning desire for justice, and more like a grim commitment to professional survival, to cleaning up the messes before they engulfed the precinct house. He viewed Appleton's zeal with a paternal exasperation. That kind of pure, unadulterated belief in the system was a liability in this particular war zone. Appleton, conversely, carried his past like a shield and a sword. His own history, perhaps a family member lost to the very powder Nino was pushing, drove him with a relentless, almost punishing energy. He was the intellectual hunter, poring over bank records and phone taps, trying to find the intellectual flaw in Nino's seemingly perfect, violent logic. He needed Nino to pay for everything, personally and publicly, a need that sometimes blinded him to the necessary dirty work Stone understood was required to secure a conviction that would actually stick. The relationship between Nino and Pookie serves as the tragic core of the Empire's fragility. Pookie, more sensitive, perhaps more grounded in the memories of their shared humble origins, begins to buckle under the pressure of Nino's escalating cruelty. As Nino sheds any pretense of camaraderie for sheer terror as a management tool, Pookie realizes the price of the throne is his own soul. This internal conflict within the ranks is more telling than any external police raid. Empires built on fear always harbor the seeds of their own internal sabotage. Nino's headquarters, draped in expensive fabrics and protected by lookouts wired into the neighborhood's very nervous system, becomes a metaphor for his isolation. He is surrounded by wealth but utterly alone, paranoid that every subordinate is plotting his downfall. He mistakes fear for respect, a common error among self-made despots. When the detectives manage to flip minor players, the paranoia metastasizes, turning his lieutenants against each other through manufactured suspicion. The investigation becomes a grueling exercise in patience, with Stone often having to pull Appleton back from impulsive confrontations that would alert Nino prematurely. They walk a tightrope between respecting the law and acknowledging the law's impotence against Nino's resources. They realize that to truly beat Nino, they can't just catch him with a brick of cocaine. They have to dismantle the infrastructure of fear he's built, making it safer for people to talk than to stay silent. When the final net tightens, it's less a dramatic siege and more an inevitable closing of a trap baited with broken promises and unpaid debts. Nino's final moments are characterized by a pathetic rage, the realization that his vision of ultimate power was ephemeral. He wasn't some grand historical figure. He was just a very successful criminal whose luck ran out when the cost of maintaining his operation exceeded his ability to intimidate the witnesses. His fall serves as a stark, brutal lesson. In the jungle, even the apex predator eventually succumbs to the environment it helped poison. The vacuum he leaves behind is palpable, a momentary lull in the chaos, allowing Stone and Appleton a fleeting, exhausted victory before they turn their attention, weary and knowing, to the next challenger who is already emerging from the shadows. The air in Nino's territory was thick, a mixture of stale cigarette smoke, cheap perfume, and the undeniable metallic tang of money earned through blood. Nino's evolution from a street-level dealer to a kingpin was less a moral descent and more a mastering of the market. reflecting a distorted American ideal. If you couldn't join the legitimate system, you built your own, better one, more lucrative, more immediate. He saw himself as an innovator, even adopting the slick, almost corporate presentation style that marked the era's successful entrepreneurs, just focused on a different commodity. His confidence was a performance that never ended, a constant assertion of dominance necessary to keep the layers of his organization functioning without questioning his absolute authority. Stone's cynicism wasn't simply weariness, it was the scar tissue of having seen countless bright young faces like Appleton's either burn out or become corrupted. He appreciated Appleton's fire, but he distrusted zeal that lacked pragmatism. Stone moved through the city like a ghost, knowing the back alleys and the unspoken rules better than any precinct manual could teach. His motivation was less about grand justice and more about the small, tangible victory of putting one specific monster behind bars, giving the neighborhood a brief reprieve from the terror. Appleton's drive was rooted in a deep personal sense of imbalance. He saw the drug trade not as economics, but as an active, daily erasure of community. He wanted to hurt Nino where it mattered, his reputation, his perceived invincibility. This led to moments where Appleton pushed Stone to bend procedural rules, recognizing that taking down a figure operating outside the law required sometimes fighting fire with a controlled but equally dangerous blaze. Their partnership was a grudging respect. Stone provided the necessary grounding in street reality, and Appleton provided the persistent, investigative thrust that kept the case from stagnating in bureaucratic quicksand. The tragedy of Pookie's arc was the death of innocence within Nino's inner circle. Pookie represented the original bond, the shared memory of struggling together before the crack money arrived. As Nino's paranoia increased, fueled by the constant threat of betrayal from rivals and law enforcement alike, he began to purge anyone who could testify with true emotional impact against him. Pookie wasn't executed for incompetence. He was eliminated because his conscience, or perhaps just his fear, made him an unreliable asset. This act solidified for the police, and for the audience, that Nino was no longer just a successful businessman, but a sociopath whose appetite for control devoured even his oldest loyalties. The climax, when it arrived, was messy and sudden, as most street revolutions are. Nino's fortified position didn't crumble under a frontal assault, but rather through a meticulously placed informational strike. The evidence Appleton and Stone managed to secure, often through dangerous, behind-the-scenes maneuvering, perhaps turning a disgruntled runner or exploiting a discrepancy in Nino's complex accounting of his illicit gains, was the poison that turned his lieutenants against him, forcing them into protective custody deals or turning them into reluctant witnesses. In his final moments of confrontation, Nino wasn't roaring defiance. He was sputtering disbelief. The tailored suit suddenly looked ill-fitting, the expensive watch a useless accessory. He had mastered the business of chaos, yet failed to master the simplest human element: trust. His downfall wasn't a systemic victory so much as a human one. The failure to account for the limits of fear when faced with overwhelming evidence and the promise of a lighter sentence. The silence following Nino's removal was heavy, not just with relief, but with the grim knowledge that the infrastructure he perfected, the supply chains, the territorial control, the allure of fast money, remained firmly in place, waiting for the next ambitious player to step into the spotlight, armed with a slightly different plan but the exact same hunger. The aftermath of Nino's fall settles over the city like a cold, damp fog, revealing the structural damage beneath the surface glamour of his reign. Stone and Appleton stand on the periphery of the captured empire, the confiscated cash and seized luxury vehicles feeling less like trophies and more like salvaged wreckage. Their victory is provisional, a successful amputation rather than a cure. Stone, leaning against the squad car, the glow of the flashing lights reflecting dully in his eyes, already looks beyond the paperwork, sensing the familiar vacuum forming. He knows the game demands a new player, and that player is likely already observing the missteps of Nino's brief tenure, calculating how to avoid the fatal errors of overconfidence and excessive visibility. Appleton, though momentarily vindicated by the sight of Nino being processed, feels the hollow echo of his personal quest. He put the man away, yet the systemic sickness that allowed Nino to flourish remains untouched. His idealism is tempered now, not broken, but hardened by the understanding that catching the king only disrupts the supply chain for a season. He looks at the neighborhoods that Nino terrorized, now eerily quiet, and sees not peace, but pregnant pause. The energy Nino commanded hasn't vanished. It's merely dispersed, hiding in the shadows, waiting for a central figure to coalesce around again. The true legacy of Nino Brown, the detectives realize, isn't the body count or the seized assets, but the blueprint he perfected. He demonstrated how rapidly one could ascend using the tools of desperation and organization. Aspiring players, many of them former low-level cash money foot soldiers, are watching the narrative intently. They aren't mourning Nino. They are studying his collapse, analyzing how the heat became too intense, how the internal security failed, and how the partnership between Stone and Appleton ultimately proved an unavoidable cross-section of street cunning and dogged procedure. The narrative now shifts subtly toward the inevitable resurgence. We see glimpses of younger, hungrier figures emerging from the ruins, perhaps adopting a different aesthetic, more digitally connected, less ostentatious than Nino's flashy, 80s-tinged materialism, preferring subtlety over spectacle. They learned from Nino's downfall that absolute public domination draws too much scrutiny. They are the next generation, incorporating the lessons of the previous empire's failure into their own foundational strategy. Stone and Appleton are left with the grim knowledge that their triumph was merely intermission music. They exchange a look, a silent acknowledgement that their careers will be defined not by the men they catch, but by the endless Sisyphean task of chasing the next iteration of the same pervasive hunger that built Nino Brown's world in the first place. The city remains a jungle, and the hunt, frustratingly, has only just resumed. The quiet that settled after Nino's imprisonment felt synthetic, the kind of silence before a storm breaks in a suffocatingly humid summer evening. Stone found himself unable to settle back into the familiar rhythm of precinct life. The paper trail leading to Nino's conviction was meticulous, a testament to months of grinding, thankless work, yet it left him deeply unsatisfied. He saw the ghost of Nino in every new, slick-haired kid walking with too much swagger down the precinct hallway, kids who hadn't even been on the scene when Nino started, yet absorbed his legend like gospel. Stone was haunted by the knowledge that he had merely removed a symptom, not the underlying contagion of desperation that made Nino's business model so tragically viable. His commitment, once rooted in weary duty, had calcified into a sort of grim fatalism about the permanence of the struggle. Appleton, for his part, found the public accolades grating. He'd achieved the textbook victory, but the community healing he envisioned hadn't materialized. The corner Nino controlled was now occupied by several smaller, less organized operations, a fracturing of power that brought localized, petty violence instead of Nino's centralized, terrifying stability. Appleton began to wrestle with the bureaucracy he once championed. He saw how the internal machinery of law enforcement could move glacially slow, often missing the crucial, immediate moments where intervention could save lives, preferring instead the slow, undeniable accumulation of evidence for a long-term incarceration that felt increasingly like a delayed consolation prize. His youthful fire was now banked, smoldering with a deeper, more complicated understanding of injustice. The vacuum was indeed being filled with alarming speed, demonstrating the ecosystem's efficiency. The new players weren't trying to replicate Nino's opulent display. That had proven to be a fatal attractant. They were quieter, more technologically savvy, using encrypted communications and operating with a decentralized structure that made them far harder to decapitate with a single major bust. They learned from Nino's over-reliance on personal charisma and loyalty, opting instead for layered anonymity and transactional relationships. This shift represented an evolution of the hustle, smarter, colder, and perhaps more dangerous precisely because they lacked the visible ego that Nino displayed, making them harder for the veterans like Stone to read. Stone and Appleton found themselves positioned uncomfortably between two eras. They were experts in the visible, hierarchical drug kingpin model, but the emergent threat was diffuse and slippery. Their collaboration, once a tense necessity, began to fray under this new pressure. Stone wanted to adapt, to understand the digital front and the new methods of distribution, leaning into the shades of gray that Appleton once resisted. Appleton, however, felt an impulse to stick rigidly to procedure, fearing that chasing the shadows of the new crew would require them to become exactly the kind of ethically compromised operators Nino relied on. Their shared success against Nino was overshadowed by their diverging paths regarding how to fight the next war. They had beaten the man, but the city was already breeding his successor, a successor who had already studied the tape of Nino's defeat and was correcting the script. The air hung heavy with the knowledge that their moment of triumph was just a pause in an endless cycle, and they were already too tired to appreciate the brief respite. The weight of the next battle settles immediately upon the shoulders of Stone and Appleton, a heavier burden than the capture of Nino himself, for this new adversary is formless, less a single personality to be crushed, and more a persistent ideology of organized greed. Stone starts spending his off hours in dimly lit bars, not for respite, but to cultivate new informants among the mid-level runners who never fully bought into Nino's visible empire. He sees in their nervous glances the same old story, ambition stifled by legitimate opportunity. But now these newcomers view Nino not as a cautionary tale, but as a flawed template. They admire the speed of his rise, but despise the flamboyant recklessness that left him vulnerable to surveillance and testimony. Stone tries to convey this creeping shift to Appleton, articulating that the battleground has moved from flashy street corners to untraceable digital networks and offshore accounts. Appleton, resisting the urge to embrace the murky tactics that nearly compromised their pursuit of Nino, doubles down on procedure, believing that strict adherence to the law is the only defense against the ethical decay he witnessed firsthand. His idealism has curdled into a rigid formalism. He fears that bending the rules again, even to catch a more elusive enemy, will simply validate Nino's worldview, that the system only works when manipulated. This creates a tense silence between the partners, a professional gulf where once there was only strategic friction. Appleton pores over wiretaps, frustrated by the encrypted chatter that reveals structure but offers no names, no faces to put on warrants. He misses the clear hierarchy of Nino's organization, where a single successful raid could disrupt the entire chain of command. The new players are indeed learning from the King of Crack's mistakes. They operate with a corporate detachment, viewing street associates as interchangeable contractors rather than family or loyal soldiers. There is less visible violence, at least initially, because destruction draws attention. They are the inheritors of Nino's efficiency, but stripped of his temper. Stone recognizes the danger. They don't need the public facade of wealth. They need only the smooth flow of capital and product, making their operations nearly invisible until the damage to the community is already systemic and deep-seated. The emotional toll is evident. Stone starts drinking more heavily, not just out of cynicism, but out of a creeping sense of irrelevance. He perfected the art of catching the visible tyrant, and now the tyranny has become invisible, operating in the ether. Appleton, facing the failure of his victory to fundamentally alter the city's trajectory, becomes withdrawn, consumed by the paperwork that represents his last tether to his sense of order. They are both mourning the singular, recognizable enemy they managed to defeat, realizing that in the war on drugs, the only true victory is never achieving the success of the man you just put away. The silence in the precinct is deafening, punctuated only by the faint, buzzing static of communications from the next generation already setting up their own shadowy empires, meticulously charting a course to avoid Nino's specific, very public downfall. The air in the precinct house has grown stale, tainted by the bittersweet residue of a victory that offered no true solace. Stone watches Appleton, seeing the slow erosion of his partner's faith. The clean lines of the law that Appleton once clung to are proving useless against an enemy that operates outside the recognized architecture of crime. Appleton's dedication has shifted from passionate pursuit to obsessive compliance. He ensures every affidavit is flawless, every piece of evidence triple-bagged, hoping that procedural perfection can somehow compensate for the strategic void left by Nino's monolithic structure. He is attempting to rebuild a fortress with outdated blueprints, relying on the very rigidity that Nino exploited years ago. Stone, conversely, feels the pull of the darkness creeping in. He starts meeting with mid-level players who were just pawns in Nino's game, men now resentful of the new, impersonal leadership. These informants speak in the clipped, careful language of people terrified of surveillance, not street brawls. They describe the new distribution system as decentralized, almost algorithmic, making the classic police tactic of arresting the boss and watching the organization seize up entirely obsolete. Stone learns that the new money flows differently, less cash in hand, more instantaneous digital transfers, a ghost economy that leaves no physical evidence for a detective reliant on paper trails and informants meeting in back alleys. He begins to understand that Nino, for all his faults, was predictable. This new breed views predictability as weakness. The emotional chasm between the partners widens into an active rift. During a briefing on a new wave of synthetic drugs appearing on the streets, products seemingly devoid of the human connection, the street-level sales pitch that defined Nino's era, Appleton argues for a massive, coordinated surveillance operation based on old RICO statutes. Stone cuts him off, his voice raspy, arguing that they are chasing phantoms. They aren't building an empire for show, Scotty. They're building a logistics network. We catch a courier, 3 more pop up tomorrow, untraceable. We need to understand the code, not just the players. The argument ends not with resolution, but with a strained silence, each man certain the other is either too naive or too compromised to see the true nature of the threat. The new challengers are masterful students of their predecessors' downfall. They avoid the overt displays of wealth that marked Nino's reign. No tailored suits, no ostentatious apartment fortresses. Their visibility is low, their communication encrypted to a degree that makes even Stone's best street contacts useless. They operate with the cold efficiency of a successful startup that prioritizes scalability and minimal risk. They have learned that the most effective prison for a drug dealer in the modern era isn't the physical cell, but the inability to transfer funds or communicate effectively. They are building a system that can survive the temporary incarceration of any single leader, a hydra whose heads are purely digital and financial. Stone and Appleton are left staring at a map where the territory they once knew intimately has been entirely redrawn, the landmarks of power erased, and the hunt begins anew, colder and far less certain than before. The slow, inexorable march of evolution in the underworld is a cruel teacher, and Stone and Appleton find themselves marooned on the wrong side of the lesson plan. Stone starts viewing the city not as a concrete jungle, but as a vast, poorly managed server farm, where Nino was the charismatic, doomed administrator who relied too heavily on hardwired connections. He spends late nights looking at data streams, feeling a profound alienation from the very ground he swore to protect. His drinking has taken on a desperate edge, an attempt to dull the realization that the tools of his trade, the informants, the door kicks, the gut instinct, are becoming obsolete against an enemy that communicates through light pulses and hidden algorithms. There's a visible defeat in the way he carries himself, the weight of every past bust feeling meaningless against this formless successor. Appleton's rigidity, meanwhile, becomes a form of self-preservation. If he abandons procedure, He fears he becomes indistinguishable from the criminals he hunts. He sees the new decentralized model as a moral test. Can law enforcement defeat sophisticated, leaderless criminality, using only the pure, vetted evidence required in a federal court? He clings to the hope that every transaction leaves a paper trail, even if that trail is buried under layers of offshore shell companies and cryptocurrency obfuscation. His relationship with Stone degrades into near silence, punctuated only by sharp, procedural arguments. When Stone suggests using more aggressive, unorthodox pressure points, perhaps harassing the periphery associates with civil forfeiture actions, Appleton recoils, accusing him of adopting Nino's playbook of intimidation against the small fry. The new organization's success lies in its very blandness. They don't inspire loyalty through charisma or fear through public spectacle. They inspire compliance through impeccable logistics and guaranteed payouts. They are the ultimate middle management, executing perfect supply chain synchronization. The younger criminals who flow into these new ranks are less street soldiers and more specialized technicians, coders, accountants, and logistics experts who view the distribution of narcotics as a complex form of outsourcing. They never knew the terror of Nino's immediate violent retribution. They only know the efficiency of their current contract. This subtle, structural shift represents the true tragedy for the two detectives. They succeeded in removing the visible manifestation of corruption, but they failed to excise the root cause, the market demand, and the allure of extra-legal wealth creation. Stone looks out at the cityscape, seeing not the glittering towers of legitimate success, but the hidden digital scaffolding supporting the next wave of criminality. He understands, with a sickening clarity, that Nino Brown, the loud, violent king, was perhaps the easier foe. The true fight isn't against a man. It's against an economic principle that the city itself nurtures. Appleton is left chasing data points that dissolve upon inspection, realizing that justice, when applied too slowly, becomes irrelevant. They are two seasoned warriors trained for sword fighting, now facing an opponent wielding invisible drones. Their exhaustion is profound, a realization that the victory over Nino was simply the closing of a chapter, not the end of the book. The air in the precinct feels thick with the dust of the past, a fine powder clinging to every file cabinet and coffee mug, the remnants of the Nino Brown investigation. Stone doesn't bother trying to conceal his growing reliance on the bottle. It's a constant companion now, a means of drowning out the low hum of anxiety that accompanies the understanding that the real battle never ended. He watches Appleton, recognizing the dangerous rigidity taking hold. Scotty is trying to fit the chaotic, amorphous threat of the new drug trade into the neat boxes of 1980s organized crime statutes. It's a futile gesture, like trying to catch smoke with a butterfly net. Stone sees the hollowness in the procedural victories. Every meticulously filed report feels like a desperate note in a bottle tossed into a digital ocean. Appleton's adherence to the letter of the law has become an almost religious fervor, a defense mechanism against the moral ambiguity that defined their hunt for Nino. He believes that if he can maintain ethical purity now, he can somehow negate the compromises, the threats whispered, the evidence skirted, that were necessary to secure Nino's downfall. He stares at network diagrams provided by federal agents, diagrams full of acronyms and pathways that mean nothing to his street-honed instincts. He feels betrayed by the very nature of modern criminality, which has dispensed with the need for the charismatic figurehead he specialized in dismantling. He misses the direct confrontation, the clear line of sight to his target, because now the enemy is everywhere and nowhere. The successor, or rather, the collective successors, have perfected the art of insulation. They aren't interested in being local legends. They are interested in market share and operational security. Stone hears whispers that the new crews view Nino's tenure as a lesson in excessive branding. They operate under the radar, utilizing decentralized networks that mimic legitimate tech startups, offering anonymity and efficiency as their primary product. When they eliminate competition, it's often quiet, a sudden bankruptcy, a targeted data breach, or the swift disappearance of a logistical weak point, rather than a public execution designed to instill terror. This subtlety is unnerving to Stone. It implies a professionalism devoid of human emotion, a purely capitalist approach to narcotics distribution. The emotional disconnect between the partners is now a vast, unspoken canyon. Stone longs for the days when a shared danger could force alignment. Now, their differing philosophies on engagement serve only to isolate them further. He sees Appleton retreating further into paperwork, a sanctuary of order in a world spiraling into informational chaos. Stone knows he must learn the new language of this underworld, the coding, the finance, the digital shadows, or he will be utterly useless. He finds himself sympathizing, dangerously, with the ruthlessness required to adapt, a sympathy that Appleton would view as a complete surrender to the darkness they thought they had just conquered. They are both stuck, honoring a past victory, while the future of urban crime evolves rapidly beyond their grasp, leaving them as relics trained for a war that is already over. The evolution of the threat is relentless, a grim, inevitable consequence of success. Stone now views the city not as a place to patrol, but as a failing network architecture, and he is the legacy antivirus program desperately scanning for obsolete threats. His conversations with informants are less about where the next shipment is coming from, and more about tracing cryptocurrency flows and understanding dark web marketplaces. He has taken to late-night study sessions, poring over cybersecurity textbooks with the same intensity he once reserved for tracking Nino's movements. This intellectual pivot is fueled by a deep-seated fear. If he cannot speak the new language of crime, he will be relegated to chasing ghosts, forever one step behind the invisible infrastructure that replaced Nino. The alcohol helps numb the sting of irrelevance. Appleton remains locked in his procedural bunker, interpreting the new decentralized operations as a tactical overcorrection born of fear, rather than a genuine evolutionary leap. He believes that all crime, no matter how sophisticated its wrapping, eventually requires human interaction, a handoff, a bribe, a moment of vulnerability. He pushes his team to focus on the weakest links, the human element, hoping to force a breakdown in the perfectly orchestrated digital ballet. However, this focus means he consistently misses the broader pattern. He is looking for the crack in the wall while the enemy is tunneling deep underground. His moral purity is costing them ground, as his refusal to engage in any ethically gray area, like exploiting a known vulnerability in a lower-level associate's personal communication, leaves key data points untouched. The tension between him and Stone manifests in terse, written memos rather than shouting matches. They have retreated to their respective ideological territories. The new syndicate avoids the spectacle that was Nino's downfall. There are no public turf wars. Turf is now defined by server access and market dominance, not street corners. They are remarkably disciplined, operating with an almost puritanical focus on profit maximization and risk aversion. They learned from Nino's fatal attraction to fame and violence. Their success is predicated on being utterly forgettable to the average beat cop. They are a corporation with no discernible CEO, which means taking down a single operative yields no systemic advantage. Stone realizes that Nino was a lightning rod. These new operators are groundwater, ubiquitous and impossible to drain entirely. The profound weariness that settles over Stone is laced with regret. He sometimes wonders if they should have let Nino live, just to keep the target visible. Nino was a known quantity, a comprehensible evil. This new structure is an intellectual puzzle that demands a different kind of detective, one trained for abstract warfare. A profile Stone and Appleton simply do not fit. They achieved the ultimate localized victory against the flashy tyrant, but in doing so, they inadvertently cleared the path for a more insidious, enduring form of organized predation. They look at each other across the squad room, two battle-hardened veterans who just won the last war, staring down the barrel of the next one. knowing with absolute certainty that they are already fundamentally unprepared for the quiet, digital siege that has already begun. The atmosphere in the task force room has transmuted from the adrenaline-fueled chaos of the Nino Brown takedown to a stagnant, thick air of intellectual impasse. Stone has retreated further into his shell, the glow of his monitor providing the only light during his self-imposed training. He's not just studying code, he's studying the anatomy of invisibility. His frustration is not directed at the criminals now, but at the limitations of his own established reality. He recalls the intoxicating certainty of hunting Nino, a clear target, a discernible hierarchy, a tangible base of operations. Now, he feels like an archaeologist tasked with excavating a civilization that communicates solely through satellite signals. His drinking is less about numbing pain and more about maintaining a state of low-grade alertness, hoping that a haze of whiskey might allow him to perceive the patterns hidden in the noise. Appleton, meanwhile, views Stone's pivot to digital forensics as a moral failing, a tacit admission that Nino's methods, the willingness to operate in the shadows and bend rules, were necessary for effectiveness. He interprets Stone's new obsession as a flirtation with the darkness they swore to eliminate. Appleton buries himself deeper in paper evidence, cross-referencing old financial records from Nino's empire with contemporary banking anomalies, searching for a tangible anchor point in the new, fluid system. His victories now are small, procedural confirmations, a correctly filed subpoena, a witness whose sworn testimony holds up under intense scrutiny. He champions these minor technical wins as proof that the old ways still matter, that the foundation of justice, though slow, is unbreakable. He is clinging to procedure as a life raft, terrified that if he lets go, the currents of the new criminal landscape will sweep him away entirely. The new syndicate operates with the chilling efficiency of automation. They are not bound by the need for street credibility or neighborhood intimidation. Their power projection is financial. They control the market access points, often working remotely, outsourcing the physical risks to a rotating cast of disposable contractors who have no personal loyalty to the organization's unseen leadership. This makes profiling impossible. Stone notes that the typical signs of an emerging kingpin, the sudden acquisition of luxury goods, the aggressive recruitment of young talent, are absent. Instead, there are small, almost imperceptible shifts in legitimate economic sectors. A sudden influx of cash into low-profile tech investments, the purchase of secure server farms in remote locations. Nino was a bonfire. These successors are deep geothermal heat, constant, pervasive, and difficult to measure. The rift between the two detectives becomes a tactical liability. During a high-level briefing, when Stone suggests using a controversial data mining technique they had previously avoided due to privacy concerns, Appleton delivers a sharp, public rebuke, citing protocols they nearly violated catching Nino. The resulting division means the task force operates with fractured authority. Stone pursues the data shadows, often without official sanction, while Appleton rigidly enforces the perimeter of legality, effectively ceding the high ground to the unseen enemy. They are two halves of a successful whole that no longer fit the equation. They manage to eliminate a symbol of chaos, only to usher in an era of silent organizational malignancy, a fate far more difficult to prosecute, and perhaps more devastating to the city's long-term health. The precinct lights, always harsh and unforgiving, seem to mock Stone's strained attempts at digital mastery. He rubs his eyes, the grit of sleepless nights compounded by the stale whiskey clinging to his breath. He doesn't see lines of code on the screen. He sees the spectral faces of Nino's crew, the young men whose loyalty he once managed to buy with street knowledge, now replaced by youths who trust only encryption keys. Stone's cynicism has deepened into a bone-deep fatalism. He realizes that while Nino performed for power, the new adversaries simply are power, embedded in the unseen architecture of modern commerce. His attempts to adapt are clumsy, fueled by desperation rather than understanding, and he finds himself frequently seeking advice from younger, uniformed tech specialists, a humiliation he barely tolerates, masking his need for instruction with gruff commands. Appleton, meanwhile, is becoming an artifact of a bygone era of policing. His dedication to procedure has hardened into an almost pathological need for control. He polices the investigation with the same unyielding scrutiny he once applied to a suspect's alibi, terrified that any deviation from established protocol will open a loophole large enough for the new syndicate to slip through. He views Stone's venture into the digital shadows with profound suspicion, seeing it as the slippery slope that nearly cost them Nino. He imagines the digital operators, faceless, emotionless, as the ultimate corruption, a threat so abstract it defies the very concept of human justice he dedicated his life to upholding. When he reviews Stone's tentative digital probes, he sees not innovation, but the potential for illegal surveillance, another path leading back to the moral compromises he fought so hard to distance himself from after Nino's arrest. The new organization's genius is their utter lack of narrative. They have no mythology, no tragic backstories, and no public egos to exploit. Their leaders are not named. They are identified by their digital signatures, temporary, fluid identifiers that dissolve and reform like malware. They have studied Nino's entire media presence and concluded that visibility equals vulnerability. They move capital across borders with the speed of thought, making jurisdictional disputes a primary weapon against law enforcement. When a local connection is compromised, it is done so cleanly. A quiet resignation, a sudden relocation to a tax haven, leaving nothing for Stone and Appleton to leverage into a public prosecution that might actually deter others. The emotional friction between the partners has reached a silent, toxic equilibrium. They share the same space but inhabit different realities of law enforcement. When they occasionally sit across from each other during lunch breaks, the silence is heavy with unspoken recrimination. Appleton believing Stone has lost his moral compass. Stone believing Appleton is clinging to archaic methods that guarantee failure. They achieved a landmark victory against the dramatic evil, but they are now utterly unequipped for the subtle, systemic rot taking hold. The city breathes easier for Nino's absence, but the disease of illicit wealth has merely mutated, adopting a more efficient, less recognizable strain. Stone feels the bitter truth crystallize. They didn't defeat organized crime. They merely forced it to become better organized. Mario Van Peebles' 1991 film, New Jack City, didn't just arrive. It exploded onto the cultural landscape, a visceral, neon-drenched testament to the crack epidemic that had ravaged American inner cities. This was not a slow-burn character study. It was a high-octane cautionary tale, delivered with the speed and brutality of the very product it depicted. The film's enduring power lies in its unflinching portrayal of ambition warped by capitalism, channeled through the terrifying ascent of Nino Brown. Wesley Snipes' embodiment of Nino is crucial to the film's success. Snipes, already possessing a dynamic physicality, honed through roles in films like Major League and Mo Better Blues, perfectly captures the magnetic charisma and chilling ruthlessness of a man who sees a void in the market and fills it with deadly efficiency. Nino isn't merely a gangster, he is an entrepreneur operating outside the law, viewing the acquisition of territory and the systematic exploitation of his community as shrewd business strategy. His wardrobe, the sharp suits, the flashy jewelry, isn't just about showing off. It's the uniform of a self-made CEO whose product is instant gratification laced with slow destruction. The film smartly borrows structural elements from Scarface, but filters them through a specifically late 80s/early 90s urban lens, exchanging Miami cocaine glamour for the gritty, localized terror of crack dissemination. The opposing force, the anti-drug unit, is spearheaded by Detective Scotty Appleton, portrayed with restrained intensity by Ice-T. Ice-T, known widely for his pioneering work in gangsta rap, brought an authenticity to the law enforcement role that resonated deeply with audiences familiar with the street narrative. Appleton's journey is framed by personal tragedy, the murder of his parents, which fuels his singular obsession with bringing down Nino. This personal stake elevates the conflict beyond standard police procedural. It becomes a vendetta. The dynamic between Appleton and his partner, Nick Parsef, played by Judd Nelson, who often struggles with the ethical lines blurred by undercover work, provides the necessary tension regarding the methods used to combat such overwhelming evil. The film's visual language is striking. Van Peebles, drawing on his experience in music videos and independent filmmaking, employs rapid editing and stylized violence that mirrors the frenetic pace of the drug trade itself. The cinematography often bathes scenes in harsh, artificial light, reflecting the synthetic nature of the high Nino is selling. This stylistic choice, while sometimes criticized for glorifying the lifestyle, effectively communicates the intoxicating allure that keeps people hooked, both as users and as dealers. Perhaps the most complex character, however, is the one who facilitates Nino's eventual downfall. The former addict-turned-informant, G Money, played by Clarence Williams III. Williams, an actor whose career spanned from the groundbreaking television series The Mod Squad to more independent roles, brings a weary, world-weary wisdom to G Money. He understands the system because he was consumed by it. His eventual turn against Nino is motivated not by a sudden moral awakening, but by the cold realization that Nino's empire is ultimately self-consuming. G Money's evolution from a loyal foot soldier to the agent of Nino's destruction underscores the film's central thesis. In this deadly ecosystem, betrayal is the ultimate form of survival or revenge. New Jack City stands as a seminal piece of early 90s cinema precisely because it dared to look directly at a national crisis without offering easy answers. It is loud, sometimes melodramatic, but undeniably potent. It critiques the systemic failures that allow such empires to rise while simultaneously charting the inevitable, violent collapse inherent in an enterprise built on human suffering. The legacy of the film is cemented not just in its quotability, crack is whack, but in its uncompromising depiction of what happens when American dreams are hijacked and sold back to the impoverished in toxic, highly addictive doses. The raw energy pulsating through New Jack City is inextricably linked to its soundtrack and musical sensibility, elements that Van Peebles expertly integrated. The film doesn't just feature music. The music is the environment. The early scenes establishing the rise of the Cash Money brothers, Nino, G Money, and Keystone, are scored with an almost relentless beat that mimics the constant hustle required to stay on top. This rhythmic backdrop amplifies the feeling that life in this world is a perpetual performance demanding constant energy and spectacle. Nino Brown's emotional landscape, though often masked by bravado, reveals a profound loneliness born from his absolute self-reliance. His disdain for conventional authority, be it the police or established neighborhood figures, stems from a deep-seated belief that the traditional routes to success are rigged against him. He operates with a childlike, possessive fury, exemplified in his treatment of women and subordinates. For Nino, loyalty is currency, and betrayal is met with immediate, almost ritualistic violence, demonstrating a pathological need for total control over his immediate surroundings as compensation for his alienation from the wider societal structure. His ambition isn't just financial, it is deeply personal, a desire to impose his will where he felt powerless previously. Scotty Appleton's internal conflict is far more nuanced than simple law enforcement duty. His undercover persona requires him to become intimately familiar with the underworld he despises, forcing him to inhabit the very mindset that killed his parents. The constant immersion in the morally gray area of infiltration chips away at his resolve. We see the strain in the tense silences between him and Parsef, a dynamic reflecting the broader societal debate of the time. Can you defeat monsters without becoming one? Appleton's victory, when it finally arrives, is tinged with exhaustion rather than triumph, emphasizing the pyrrhic nature of such battles. Keystone, as the third leg of Nino's trinity, offers a slightly different, almost tragic perspective. Portrayed by Brandon Adams, Keystone represents the younger generation being immediately drawn into the enterprise, dazzled by the spoils before understanding the cost. His trajectory serves as a stark warning about the short-term seduction of fast money. Where Nino is a visionary tyrant, Keystone is a devotee, whose blind adherence eventually puts him in direct conflict with Nino's increasingly paranoid control structure. His fate is a direct consequence of the intoxicating environment Nino cultivates, an environment where even family ties break under the pressure of perceived disloyalty. The film masterfully uses architecture and setting to underscore its themes. The contrast between the opulent, heavily secured safe houses Nino inhabits, symbols of his corrupted success, and the decaying, neglected neighborhoods where the actual product is sold and consumed, highlights the parasitic nature of his business model. He builds a fortress using the very desperation brewing outside his gates. This visual dissonance creates a palpable sense of injustice, making Nino's eventual fall feel almost necessary for the restoration of narrative equilibrium, even if Van Peebles ensures that the audience understands the system that produced Nino remains firmly in place, awaiting the next entrepreneur. The final, drawn-out confrontation between Nino and Appleton is less a shootout and more a final, desperate struggle between two ideologies of power and survival within the same broken landscape. The emotional weight carried by the supporting characters often provides the necessary counterpoint to Nino Brown's volcanic charisma. The narrative hinges on the cyclical nature of addiction and consequence, best illustrated through the experiences of the street-level dealers and users who orbit the Cash Money Brothers empire. These faces in the crowd, though secondary, ground the film's spectacle in genuine human tragedy. We are frequently shown the rapid dissolution of lives, families shattered, futures erased, by the product that Nino so efficiently distributes. This relentless depiction of collateral damage prevents the film from becoming purely an action thriller. It forces the audience to confront the societal toll. Consider the dynamic within the Cash Money Brothers themselves. While G-Money eventually sees the writing on the wall, the relationship between Nino and his other partner, Keystone, illustrates the crushing weight of Nino's ego. Nino, fueled by his past humiliations and his newfound status, cannot tolerate even the appearance of insubordination. His paranoia becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. By expecting betrayal, he actively engineers the conditions that make it unavoidable. This intense need for dominance transforms the Brotherhood into a pressure cooker, where loyalty is constantly tested by suspicion rather than external threats. Van Peebles invests significant time in depicting the mechanics of the operation, not just the glamour. The scenes detailing the packaging, distribution networks, and the strategic leveraging of fear reveal Nino as a meticulous manager, albeit one whose management style relies on terror. His understanding of supply chain logistics, twisted for illicit ends, speaks volumes about the untapped entrepreneurial spirit that the ghetto conditions channeled into criminality. It's a dark commentary. The same drive, ambition, and organizational skill that might have made him a successful, albeit aggressive, businessman in another context, is here weaponized against his own community. The police response, particularly through Appleton, is shown to be clumsy, often resorting to tactics that mirror the ruthlessness of the criminals they pursue. The tension between Appleton and the precinct captain often highlights the institutional frustration, a system ill-equipped and underfunded to tackle an enemy that innovates faster than the law can respond. Appleton's deep immersion forces him into morally compromised positions, eroding his certainty. He is battling not just Nino, but the very temptation to use the same predatory instincts to achieve his goal, suggesting that in the war on drugs, the lines between hunter and hunted become dangerously indistinct. Ultimately, New Jack City succeeds because it refuses to let the audience off easily. The final confrontation is not cathartic in the traditional sense. Nino Brown is destroyed, but the vacuum he leaves behind is immediate and palpable. The film implies that the forces that created Nino, poverty, lack of opportunity, and the lure of instant power, are structural and remain untouched. The victory feels temporary, a brief pause in a never-ending cycle, leaving the viewer with a lingering sense of dread that the next, perhaps even more ruthless entrepreneur is already organizing in the shadows, ready to take the stage under the same unforgiving neon lights. The film's lasting impact is arguably tied to its ability to function as a cultural mirror, reflecting the anxieties and shifting moral codes of the early 1990s America concerning race, policing, and unchecked capitalism. While ostensibly a crime drama, New Jack City operates as a brutal sociological document. It captures the moment when crack cocaine transcended being just another drug to become a defining force of social decay, inextricably linked with narratives of urban blight and black masculinity. The film doesn't shy away from the seduction of this lifestyle. The initial scenes showcasing the rapid accumulation of wealth and sudden status for the Cash Money brothers serve as a dark fantasy fulfillment for those trapped in systemic economic stagnation. This element of aspirational criminality is what made the film so polarizing and simultaneously so vital. It spoke a language of immediate gratification and tangible power that mainstream society often denied to its marginalized youth. Nino Brown's philosophy is fundamentally anti-establishment. He doesn't seek acceptance within the existing structure. He seeks to build an alternative, more profitable one, by leveraging the very neglect inflicted upon his community. His interactions with his mother, for instance, are deeply revealing. His attempts to buy her comfort and security with illicit gains are tainted by his inability to offer genuine emotional connection or legitimacy, underscoring that his wealth is inherently toxic and isolating. The effectiveness of Ice-T's performance as Appleton relies heavily on this contrast. Appleton represents the legitimate path, the system that promises justice through adherence to rules. Yet, the narrative consistently shows this legitimate path as slow, under-resourced, and frequently ineffective against Nino's dynamic, corporate-style ruthlessness. This forces Appleton into ethically compromising situations, often relying on the very street smarts and calculated risks that mirror the gangster mentality. His eventual triumph is therefore less about clean justice and more about tactical superiority within a dirty game, suggesting that in the hyper-capitalist, high-stakes world of the drug trade, the methods of the oppressor must sometimes be adopted by the supposed liberator. Moreover, the film's reliance on genre tropes, particularly the betrayal arc, speaks to a deeply ingrained cultural cynicism prevalent at the time. The ultimate destruction of Nino is engineered not by external law enforcement pressure alone, but by internal rot. G-Money recognizing that Nino's empire demands absolute submission, which inevitably leads to self-destruction. G-Money's decision to flip signifies the ultimate pragmatism of survival over loyalty in a world where loyalty is simply another vulnerability to be exploited. It's a narrative where every perceived alliance is conditional, a chilling reflection of the precariousness of existence within Nino's shadow. The film leaves the audience understanding that while the man is gone, the economic and social conditions ripe for the next Nino are already being cultivated, making the victory feel less like an ending and more like an intermission. The enduring resonance of New Jack City also stems from its careful construction of Nino's supporting cast, figures who serve as both victims and willing participants in the larger enterprise. The character of Keisha, Nino's girlfriend, embodies the dual intoxication and entrapment inherent in his lifestyle. Initially drawn in by the glamour and perceived security Nino offers, her arc demonstrates the fragility of relationships built upon stolen wealth and constant fear. She is an accessory to the opulence, but remains fundamentally peripheral to the true power structure, which Nino jealously guards for himself and his male associates. Her eventual fate, though often overshadowed by the main conflict, is a stark reminder that for the women orbiting these kings, the fast life offers no real sanctuary. They are trophies whose value depreciates rapidly under sustained stress and infidelity. This isolation of Nino is a key psychological component. His move from street hustler operating with his crew to the executive behind fortified glass signifies his departure from community and camaraderie into pure transactional existence. The transition is visually marked by his move into increasingly lavish yet sterile environments. These mansions are cages of his own making, where every loyal subordinate eventually becomes a potential threat and every admirer a mark. This pervasive paranoia is the tragic flaw that even his immense resourcefulness cannot overcome. He builds a kingdom designed to resist external threats, but it is fatally vulnerable to internal corrosion caused by his own tyrannical insecurity. On the side of law enforcement, the relationship between Appleton and Parsef often serves as a vehicle for exploring the ethical ambiguities of prolonged undercover work. Parsef, who is often presented as the more conventional, rule-bound officer, acts as the audience's conscience when Appleton begins to cross ethical lines in his pursuit of Nino. The necessity of adopting the adversary's methods, the lying, the manipulation, the immersion in vice, creates a palpable strain on Appleton. His success is predicated on his capacity to mirror Nino's cunning, suggesting that the system tasked with preservation sometimes has to mimic destruction to survive. This duality is expertly handled, ensuring that the final confrontation feels earned through shared psychological proximity, not just superior firepower. Furthermore, the film's use of rapid-fire dialogue and stylized confrontation captures the rapid escalation typical of this era's street narratives. The verbal sparring between Nino and Appleton is as intense as any physical exchange. Nino weaponizes confidence and sarcasm, always attempting to reframe himself as the inevitable result of a failing system, thereby challenging Appleton's moral superiority. Appleton, in turn, relies on cold, factual condemnation. These exchanges are critical because they articulate the film's central ideological battle. Is Nino an aberration that must be destroyed? Or is he the logical, albeit monstrous conclusion of entrenched societal neglect? Van Peebles ensures the film offers no easy declarative answer, leaving the viewer to grapple with the systemic indictment implicit in Nino's existence. The pervasive feeling of fatalism woven throughout New Jack City is intensified by its exploration of how wealth corrupts the very notion of community responsibility. Nino Brown, having achieved substantial financial success, doesn't funnel resources back into upliftment or institutional change. Instead, he isolates himself within the spoils, viewing his neighborhood solely as a territory to be exploited for raw materials and distribution routes. This self-serving approach stands in stark contrast to the heroic narratives often associated with successful self-made men in American cinema. Nino's success is explicitly extractive, tearing value from the community that nurtured him. His refusal to engage in any form of constructive philanthropy, even for surface-level appearances, solidifies his role not as a misguided leader, but as a purely parasitic entity. This parasitic dynamic is mirrored in the fragile alliances within the Cash Money brothers. The internal power structure is inherently unstable because Nino conflates control with affection and subordinates with property. When G-Money begins to distance himself, it is read by Nino not as a tactical divergence, but as a deep, personal betrayal worthy of immediate annihilation. This inability to delegate true autonomy or share power transforms his organization from a functional business into a cult of personality perpetually on the verge of implosion. His reliance on fear as the primary managerial tool guarantees that dissent will fester beneath the surface until it boils over, which is precisely how G-Money secures his opportunity for retaliation. The character of Detective Appleton also faces immense emotional strain due to the pressure placed upon him by the higher-ups, who are eager for a high-profile bust to satisfy political demands rather than achieving sustainable change. This institutional impatience forces Appleton into aggressive overreach. His covert alliance with G-Money is fraught with moral compromise. He is essentially trading one form of chaos for another, hoping his managed chaos leads to a better outcome than Nino's organic anarchy. The toll this takes is visible in Ice-T's understated performance, the exhaustion around the eyes, the terse delivery, suggesting that every successful maneuver brings him one step closer to the moral abyss he claims to be fighting against. Even the depiction of drug use is handled with a grim realism that cuts through the stylized action. The brief, horrific vignettes showing users overwhelmed by the product highlight the human collateral damage that Nino dismisses as acceptable overhead. These moments function as necessary, gut-wrenching pauses in the high-stakes maneuvering, grounding the viewer in the immediate devastating reality of the crack epidemic. It is this constant juxtaposition, Nino's sharp suits and pristine condos against the desolate reality of addiction, that gives the film its sharp, critical edge. New Jack City is ultimately a tragedy dressed in expensive leather, chronicling how ambition, when divorced from empathy and channeled through systemic disadvantage, becomes self-annihilating. The film's aesthetic, characterized by its saturated colors and deliberate cultivation of a distinct, almost theatrical urban style, reflects a period where hip-hop culture was aggressively asserting its visual identity onto the mainstream consciousness. Van Peebles understood that the presentation of the gangster lifestyle, the immaculate threads, the customized vehicles, the over-the-top displays of wealth, was as much a part of the product as the drugs themselves. This visual language served a dual purpose. It seduced the disenfranchised youth dreaming of escape, and simultaneously served as a gaudy, almost mocking banner waving in the face of the conventional, muted aesthetics of the establishment that marginalized them. The style is a form of visual overcompensation, a loud declaration of success in a world that denied them legitimate avenues for it. Nino Brown's commitment to this aesthetic is absolute. It is his armor. He doesn't just wear expensive clothing. He weaponizes it. His presence demands attention, a psychological tactic designed to intimidate rivals and inspire awe in followers. This meticulous outward construction contrasts sharply with the inner rot of his relationships. The few moments where that veneer cracks, often under duress from Appleton, or during moments of internal suspicion, reveal a frighteningly insecure core, a man terrified of returning to the powerlessness that once defined him. Wesley Snipes leans into this volatility, allowing fleeting glimpses of the desperate boy beneath the Emperor's robes, which only makes his eventual, inevitable confrontation more poignant, if not sympathetic. The partnership between Appleton and Parsef, while essential for driving the police plot forward, also serves as a subtle critique of the institutional approach to urban crime. Parsef often represents the procedural limitations, the need for warrants, chain of custody, and careful documentation, which Nino consistently circumvents through sheer audacity and violence. Appleton, driven by his personal crusade, is forced to operate outside these constraints, blurring the lines between law enforcement and vigilante justice. This necessary ethical slippage suggests that traditional legal mechanisms are too slow and too constrained to effectively combat an enterprise that operates with the speed and flexibility of a modern corporation. The film frames the drug war not as a battle between good and evil, but as a clash between two highly motivated, yet fundamentally different, forms of entrepreneurial ruthlessness. Furthermore, the film subtly addresses the issue of legacy and the cyclical nature of street power. The demise of Nino does not signal a cleansing of the neighborhood. It merely opens a vacuum, an opportunity for the next ambitious operator. The final scenes resist the typical Hollywood resolution where order is fully restored. Instead, the camera lingers on the environment that spawned Nino, suggesting that the underlying economic and social conditions, the lack of opportunity, the ease of access to illicit capital, are the true, persistent antagonists. New Jack City functions as a prophecy of sorts, warning that eliminating one king only ensures the swift coronation of the next, unless the foundational issues are addressed. The tragedy is not just Nino's fall, but the audience's understanding that the stage is already being set for a sequel, that the system guarantees will never truly end. The film's narrative momentum is expertly maintained by the constant push and pull between the manufactured spectacle of Nino's empire and the grinding, thankless reality faced by the police. Detective Appleton's success hinges on an uncomfortable symbiotic relationship with the criminal element, particularly G-Money. This reliance on informants steeped in the very culture they seek to dismantle highlights a profound hypocrisy within the law enforcement response. Appleton is forced to treat betrayal as a commodity, weighing the immediate tactical advantage of G-Money's cooperation against the long-term damage done to the fragile trust within any community structure. His actions, while ostensibly aimed at dismantling Nino's operation, often involve the same manipulation and exploitation that characterize Nino's own business dealings. This moral gray area is further complicated by the film's depiction of the law's reaction. The FBI and federal agencies are often portrayed as being too distant, too bureaucratic, or too slow to grasp the immediate, localized terror inflicted by the Cash Money brothers. This leaves the street-level narcotics unit, embodied by Appleton, feeling isolated and compelled to adopt increasingly questionable methods. The tension is palpable. The pursuit of justice demands speed, and speed in this context necessitates moral shortcuts. It's a feedback loop where the ruthlessness of the criminal element justifies an equally aggressive, sometimes ethically bankrupt, response from the state. Keystone's character arc, initially presented as that of an eager protege basking in the glow of Nino's success, serves as a crucial emotional anchor for the film's critique of generational immersion. He represents the younger generation who sees the immediate rewards, the cars, the clothes, the perceived respect, without the historical context of the dangers or the ultimate terminal trajectory of such a life. Nino treats Keystone with a mixture of mentorship and proprietary arrogance, failing to instill any sense of long-term strategy, only immediate execution. When Keystone inevitably falters or becomes a liability due to his inexperience or emotional attachment, Nino disposes of him with shocking coldness, reinforcing the message that in this ecosystem, sentimentality is a fatal weakness. The visual storytelling elevates the sense of urban decay against which Nino builds his glittering facade. The film frequently juxtaposes the bright, almost cartoonish violence associated with the dealers against the bleak, monochrome reality of the users huddled in stairwells or abandoned lots. This contrast is the engine of the film's indictment. Nino's wealth is literally constructed from the despair occurring just feet away from his heavily guarded entrances. He exists in a self-imposed bubble of luxury, financed by the systematic destruction of his neighbors, a critique that remains chillingly relevant to discussions of economic inequality and predatory capitalism. New Jack City refuses to let the audience appreciate the style without acknowledging the staggering human cost underwriting every expensive suit and every flashy ride. The film's deliberate pacing in establishing Nino Brown's ascent ensures that when the inevitable cracks appear in his foundation, the audience fully comprehends the magnitude of what is at risk. Nino's defining emotional characteristic is not simply greed, but a need for total, undeniable recognition. A hunger born from a past of being unseen and powerless. His early violence, often directed toward those who slighted him or failed to show proper deference, functions as an aggressive form of brand management. Every publicized act of cruelty is calculated to reinforce the market price of his reputation. Nino Brown is untouchable. This is particularly evident in his interactions with his crew, where he institutes a culture of hypervigilance, making every subordinate constantly monitor their own actions for fear of misinterpretation by the boss. This psychological pressure cooker is what ultimately makes G-Money's betrayal so effective and inevitable. G-Money, having served as Nino's pragmatic enforcer and conscience proxy for so long, understands the rules of the game better than anyone outside of Nino himself. His shift is not sudden piety. It is a cold calculation that Nino, in his paranoia, has become the single greatest threat to his own enterprise, and consequently, to G-Money's survival. G-Money understands that loyalty, when enforced by terror, is inherently temporary. His negotiation with Appleton is a masterclass in leveraging intimate knowledge of a tyrant's weaknesses, positioning himself as the necessary surgical instrument to excise the cancer of Nino's ego. On the side of the law, the personal stake driving Scotty Appleton prevents the narrative from dissolving into a procedural. His haunting flashbacks and quiet obsession with vengeance color every decision he makes. He is not just upholding the law. He is attempting to retroactively save his younger self and his murdered parents from the fate Nino represents. This deeply personal crusade justifies his willingness to step outside the rigid boundaries Parsef upholds. The friction between Appleton and Parsef often mirrors the broader societal debate. Does extraordinary threat warrant extraordinary and potentially illegal response? Van Peebles frames this dilemma without offering an easy ethical verdict, suggesting that in confronting such concentrated evil, the apparatus of justice itself may become slightly infected by the process. Visually, the film often uses tightly framed claustrophobic shots during scenes of internal crew meetings or tense interrogations, emphasizing the lack of space for maneuvering or honest communication within Nino's sphere. Conversely, when Nino is shown alone in his expansive, modernist homes, the emptiness of the space dwarfs him, emphasizing his emotional isolation despite his material success. These architectural cues reinforce the theme that Nino has traded genuine connection for control, and that control, when absolute, is ultimately unsustainable. The film's conclusion, though achieving a victory for the police, refuses to celebrate societal rebirth. It only confirms the temporary demise of one specific tyrant, leaving the oppressive economic climate intact, ready to incubate the next. The cinematic achievement of New Jack City rests heavily on its almost musical rhythm, a relentless tempo established by the interplay between the high-stakes hustle and the constant threat of violence. Mario Van Peebles curated a visual and sonic experience that mirrored the intoxicating, yet ultimately destructive, nature of the product at the center of the narrative. The score, heavily infused with contemporary R&B and hip-hop elements, acts as the bloodstream of the film, pumping adrenaline into the scenes of turf wars and escalating power plays. This musical backdrop is not mere decoration. It contextualizes the rise of the Cash Money Brothers as a cultural phenomenon, an aggressive new wave displacing older criminal structures with slicker, more corporate efficiency. Nino Brown's evolution is a masterclass in warped ambition. His early partnership with G-Money and Keystone suggests a degree of shared vision, but Nino's inherent megalomania demands singularity. He begins to see his partners not as collaborators, but as necessary extensions of his will, prone to error and necessitating stringent, often brutal management. This mirrors the trajectory of many historical corporate titans who begin with a revolutionary vision but end by demanding absolute, unquestioning fealty. Wesley Snipes perfectly conveys this shift, moving from street savvy to imperial arrogance. His body language stiffens, his gaze hardens, and his casual cruelty becomes less reactive and more performative, designed to maintain the fragile illusion of control over an enterprise spiraling rapidly due to its very nature. Scotty Appleton's descent into the undercover role